I just made a spur-of-the-moment decision to do another entry in this blog. So this is going to be a little bit even more informal than some of the others. You might have noticed that when I edit these, I have some soft dissolves. Well, that's where I forget what I'm going to say or can't remember something or stumble or whatever. I can fix it in post, as we used to say when I was in video editing. But what happened is that I've gotten online and I found a website for the Villanova University, the Falvey Memorial Library at the Villanova University. They have a digital library, and unlike a lot of universities, they let ordinary people like myself, lay researchers, get into their stash. So it so happens they have some volumes with not the whole volume, but they have selected issues of the Portland Transcript from here in Portland, Maine. And they had some editions that I didn't have, some volumes that I didn't have access to, specifically early 1850 and parts of 1853 and so on. So I did find a few that I hadn't had before. I also found something that disproves one of my speculations about Mathew's authorship. So I do want to make the point that I try to be rigorous and that I'm honest. And when I find out that I've made a mistake, I admit it. This one I'm still not 100% sure of, but there's a character who signs Caleb Leathers in the Portland Transcript from, maybe 1849 to 1855. It sounds just like Mathew. There's even a little poem in his typical dialect style. When I saw that, I thought it was clinched, except that and Mathew would do this, he would create a character and then write as that character. He did that many times. Travelogues or just write from a place, but it was actually somebody he'd created, see? So I thought he'd created a farmer from Vermont who was a locofoco, which, as I understand it, was on the liberal side of the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party was the conservatives back then in the mid-century, 19th century. So he was kind of on the liberal side of the conservatives. And he was a farmer and he was well-read and, kind of deeply philosophical and so on. It sounded exactly like Mathew. But then I ran across one here in the January 26th, 1850 edition of the Portland Transcript, where he goes on at some length about having been schoolmates with the editor of another Portland paper, the Portland Daily Advertiser, calls it the Portland Advertiser. And he names that person as Mr. Carter. Well, I can't find him, so I've written a query to the Portland room at the Portland Public Library, and this is Sunday, so maybe I'll get something tomorrow or the next day, to find out where he grew up, if I possibly can, what his full name was and where he grew up. If he grew up in Haverhill, Massachusetts, where Mathew did, then pretty much Caleb Leathers is a done deal for Mathew, I would say. But if he grew up anywhere else, I would say this is not Mathew. And the reason I say that is because the writer can be identified by this. And Mathew wouldn't leave clues where he could actually be identified. But there's just so many people that have become a Vermont farmer who was schoolmates with Mr. Carter and who are this well-educated and this philosophical. See, it narrows it down to basically one person who would have been fully known to Mr. Carter, who was a prominent person in Portland. So he's outing himself, essentially, this Caleb Leathers. That would be very unlikely for Mathew. So what I did is I went back into both my books. I just briefly mentioned it in my first book where he praises William Thackeray, William Makepeace Thackeray, and I quoted it there. In the second book, I used him quite a bit because there's, I think, 8 or 9 pieces that I found by Caleb Leathers. And so when I find a person and a signature that I assume to be Mathew's, I have to take everything he says under consideration as a clue and kind of fit it in. See, that's why my book is so big and why it took 10 years to write, basically. So now I had to take all that out. Well, like I said, on the very slim chance that the Portland room comes back to me and says, Mr. Carter was born and raised in Haverhill, Massachusetts, then I got to put it back in. Otherwise, I think I'm done with Caleb Leathers. But that's the way this research works. You win some, you lose some. Now I'm going to tell you about one that I think I won. Now, I'm aware that I've got some skeptics and some that may not be skeptical. None of these people have anywhere close to the depth of knowledge about Mathew Franklin Whittier or his work that I have. So when I come to a conclusion, I bring to that conclusion 2,300 of Mathew's works and everything I know about his life and my own intuition. I bring all that to the table to make the decision. The person that's judging me, the skeptic that's judging me, brings nothing to the table. They bring things to the table, but they bring their own knowledge base, their own database to the table. They don't bring any of my knowledge base to the table. See? So it's a mismatch. Until they have read all 2,300 of Mathew's works and read both of my books, they're not in a position to judge whether I'm being rigorous or not. See, how would they know? Honestly. So I want to provide some things for the skeptics, which I've done recently with yesterday's entry and a couple before, things that I absolutely unequivocally can prove. And that's interesting, apparently, to more people than the ones where I do the detective work. Because when I do detective work, 7 people watch. And when I present things that are absolutely 100% rock solid proof, then I get 11, or 12 or whatever. So be it, but I also believe with any luck that I have a future audience. Those people will have read Mathew's works. They will have read my books. And they will have a much deeper understanding of Mathew and Abby in their lives. So I don't want to neglect them, either. So this entry is more detective work, and it's not speculation, but it's based on a deep study of Mathew's work and life. I can't give you all the examples. I can't give you all the background. Sorry for being argumentative. I think some of the expressions of skepticism that I've run across in the last week or two have kind of rattled me. I realize what I'm up against. Oh my gosh, people are vicious, some of them, really. And I understand because they're threatened. People get vicious when they get threatened. What it means is that my work is real and it's actually reaching them at some level. Otherwise, it wouldn't bother them so much. Okay? People don't get vicious if you're just stupid, generally. They get vicious if you're threatening them somehow. So here's the thing. Mathew had this habit. I'm going to put my mouse up here. He had this habit of identifying his work and informing his work in a very interesting way. He would sign with pseudonyms, or sometimes not at all, but he would put 2 or 3 of his pieces on the page, and he was in a position to negotiate with the editors to do this. He knew the editors personally. So he would request, can you put this poem on top, and then, this piece, and maybe something next to it or below it, And the one on the top would tell you some secret about the one underneath, Now, the reason I mention this, aside from the fact that I found another one of these, and I've lost track, 20, 25 examples I could pull up that show Mathew doing this. So this isn't just speculation on my part. I've documented it over and over and over. Well, I found another one. But the importance of this is that this technique features prominently in my evidence for Edgar Allan Poe and The Raven, because Mathew used this technique several times to tell posterity that he was the real author of The Raven, that Edgar Allan Poe couldn't possibly have written it, and that Edgar Allan Poe stole it, and that he was a plagiarist, And if you haven't ever encountered this before, and if you haven't seen the other 20 examples that I have seen, which I can't, it would take an entire paper to present the other 20 examples, but know that I have them is what I'm trying to say. So this is a little precursor. I won't be coming out with that paper about Edgar Allan Poe for another 3 months, but this is a little precursor just to show you the technique. And it's personal, and I'm going to give you my feelings, which I still have Mathew's emotions and feelings. I'm going to give you that. I'm going to give you some personal background that I've gathered from studying Matthew's life, which I could back up if I had all day and somebody was willing to sit here all day. I could back these things up. Either you trust me or you don't trust me. Either when I tell you I can back these things up, either you believe me or you don't believe me. And this is the problem with skepticism. If it becomes vicious to the point where somebody decides to watch me, but they don't like me and they don't believe a damn thing I say, why are they watching? You know what I'm saying? What's the point? Unless you're trying to catch me out, Well, you won't catch me out because I'm genuine and the work is genuine. This is the thing that I felt actually from Abby and guidance from Abby about my paper. I keep wanting to find more people to write to shove it in their face, Well, the world of academia is on notice about that paper. And what I felt from her is, let the paper do the work now, because it's very powerful. That's a very strong paper. It's very logical. I've got the evidence, and it's manifestly obvious what I'm saying, especially if you look into Matthew and Abby's life and work. But even as regards Charles Dickens, it's manifestly obvious. It's a very strong paper. I don't care what the skeptics say. They all say, oh, it's drivel or it's weak or you haven't proved anything. They say that kind of stuff out of defensiveness and aggression. But I know how good that paper is. So Abby says, let the paper do its own work now. So that's what I'm going to do. So now I'm going to turn to this example. This is in the August 6th, 1853 edition of the Portland Transcript. You can find this on the Villanova Digital Library yourself. Download it. So I'm going to pull up in my Kindle my own copy. And this starts on the front page and goes on to the next couple pages, I think it is. We'll find out in a minute. And I have created a PDF. I go in with Photoshop elements and color correct it and make it a little darker and so on to where I can, save it for the future. I don't know if you can see this or not. Let's see if you can see that. Yeah. That's how I clean them up. In Villanova Digital Library, they're just horrific yellow and, kind of faded and everything. Now, right up at the top, the very first thing in this edition, under original poetry, and they typically would have a piece of poetry in the upper left-hand corner. It's written for the transcript. That means it's original. Lines to blank. That means it's personal to someone. By Bertram. Now, I have found several poems, not just in this newspaper, actually, I think 2 different papers, signed Bertram, that I'm convinced are Mathew Franklin Whittier's work. The reason he would have signed Bertram is because he was the original author of Lady Geraldine's Courtship, which was published in 1844 in a compilation by the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning. When people realized and realize currently that Poe's, well, it's not Poe's, but The Raven seems to bear some uncanny resemblances to Lady Geraldine's Courtship, it's not that Poe borrowed or admired Barrett that much. It's that they were both written by Mathew Franklin Whittier, and both of these people were plagiarists, imposters, literary imposters, really, who stole from Mathew and got famous off of Mathew's work. Elizabeth Barrett Browning got famous in part off of Lady Geraldine's Courtship and 1 or 2 others like Wine of Cyprus that Mathew had written. And Poe got famous off The Raven as a poet, and that's why they seem so similar. Well, Mathew would occasionally use Bertram as a signature because Bertram was the main character, the protagonist in Lady Geraldine's Courtship. I'm not making this stuff up. I know it seems like it to the skeptics. So this poem is by Bertram, but this is a poem to Abby in spirit. She had passed on 12 years earlier, and he had many times referred to her as a water sprite. Here he refers to her as a fairy. But the interesting thing aside from that is that he mentions the persecution she went through because she was persecuted and shunned as a witch because of her interest in the occult, which is what you see in A Christmas Carol. Not a ghost story. That's Abby's knowledge of the occult that you see that was watered down by Charles Dickens. So she was persecuted. And what he's saying here is that now, as a fairy who he's in contact with inwardly, she is no longer concerned about persecution or about shunning or about any kind of slander, as he calls it. Apparently she went through quite a time with being shunned because of this. So that's the gist of this poem. I'm going to read it, and then we're going to go on to the next piece, which this poem is preparing you for, because he stacked all these things. So he says, I know a little fairy that trips it o'er the lawn as lightly as the sunbeam breaks through the clouds of morn. Her heart is free from evil, her tongue is void of guile. A spirit's flood of sunshine seems gushing in her smile. I know a joyous spirit that fosters only love, an errant wanderer seeming from brighter realms above, so full of joy and gladness, of hope and guiltless mirth, that Eden's joy might bloom again if such could people earth. The toilsome path of duty with roses of delight is strewed beneath her footsteps, the weary to invite. With every kindred virtue and purity combined, the maiden I have pictured adds jewels of the mind, because Abby was brilliant. This gay and thoughtless creature the envious may assail, scandal may weave with cunning a dark insidious tale. Let shafts of malice turning fall harmless at her side, while pealing shouts are ringing, her slanderers to deride. So that's about Abby, who is now in spirit and is now completely free from any concern about slanderers. See? Then immediately under that, you have Select Tale, adapted from the Old French, The Goldsmith of St. Denis, a tale of ancient Paris, at the commencement of the 13th century of the Christian era in Paris. Paris is where this is set. Abby had apparently taught Mathew French. He couldn't speak it very well, which I know from one of his travelogues where he's over in Paris struggling with it, but he knew it well enough to translate. And he has apparently, I think, translated this one. I'm obviously not going to read this. It's a long story. The gist of it is that this goldsmith, who is not from Paris, he has developed such a name for himself that he's like a friend of the king and the queen, and the goldsmith for all of the wealthy and nobles and so on. And he meets a peasant girl by the roadside with her cow, who is a slave essentially of the abbey. Her whole family for generations has been attached to the abbey, and she belongs to the abbey. And he falls in love with her. And she says that anyone who would ever want to marry her would have to become a slave also and give up everything to the abbey, see? And he tries and tries to get around it, and he can't get around it. And in the meantime, his love for this girl is becoming famous in Paris. And the queen kind of takes his part and at least arranges for them to visit with a chaperone. But finally, he decides to go ahead and agrees that he will marry her and give up everything. And at that point, finally, the abbot relents and gives her freedom, see? Well, I think what this is about symbolically is that, and I felt this, whether from Abby directly or past life memory, I don't know how I came by it, but I had earlier felt that Abby considered herself a liability because her reputation was such that if he married her and tried to start a business, everybody would shun him and the business would sink. He would never be able to be successful so long as he was married to her. See? And I can feel what Matthew's response was, screw him, screw them all, and that's the way I feel now. I'm very much in the same situation now, because if I admit to you that I am married to a spirit bride, see, that's it. That's the end of my credibility. That's the end of my success. That's it, So the same karmic pattern has evolved again, which is typical with karma. But that's what she told him. And he said, the heck with it. If I have you, I don't care. And it did happen that way. His business has failed. And I think that's a big part of why. I think she was shunned. People wouldn't patronize his business. And, it was very, very tough for them. Matter of fact, she died eventually of tuberculosis. It was a rough life. But it so happens, let's see where it comes in. I don't remember how many pages we're talking about. Here we go. Immediately after this second story, which I can't objectively absolutely prove was Matthew's, comes, guess what? Ethan Spike, Matthew's one historically known piece, his series. Because if you look up Mathew Franklin Whittier, the one thing you will find that historians agree upon is that he was the author of Ethan Spike. Well, if you can see this. Oops, darn it. Hold on. I gotta be careful what I touch here. I don't know if you can see this, but that story that I just told you about is above. Immediately below is humorous, and then it says letter from Ethan Spike. See? And the letter itself, I don't think has anything to do with the subject. Could be. I haven't gone back and read it again. I doubt it. But he signed the first two by saying, please put Ethan Spike after these first two. So the editor, who at this point is Edward Elwell, knows Mathew well enough to literally comply and put Matthew's pieces as the first, second, and third on the front page of this edition of the Portland Transcript. Well, that's just one example out of, like I said, 20, 25. I don't know how many there are. But it does come up with regard to Edgar Allan Poe and the Raven, where Mathew deliberately asks that certain things follow certain things or be above certain things to inform you that that's specifically what he's talking about. Could I be wrong about that? Not about that. It would be, I could be wrong about Caleb Leathers. There's other things I've been wrong about. There was one series signed A.W., and it was poetry. And it sounded very much like Abby. This was after she had passed on. Her married initials were A.W., Abby Whittier, although she never used them. As far as I knew, she always used her maiden initials when she wrote poetry. And Mathew used her maiden initials when he published her stories and poetry. So I don't know. I thought, well, is it possible that Mathew has kind of created a person, to keep her alive, kind of, and is publishing her poetry as though she was still alive? But then I saw that a lot of it started to be signed from St. Simon's Island in Georgia, not far from where I lived in Atlanta once. I said, well, that's weird. Is it possible that she had convalesced in St. Simon and these were written while she had been convalescing before she died? And then I found a report of the commencement at Bowdoin University, near where I am now, written exactly the way Mathew would have written one, because Mathew also reported on those commencements. So now we have a reporter who writes poetry that looks like Abby's, who sometimes writes from St. Simon's Island. And not only that, but it kind of looked like it might have been a guy writing to a girl, maybe on a couple occasions. And I just took it and I put it all on the I don't know shelf. And I left in a little disclaimer, sort of, in my book that says I thought maybe I was pursuing this lead, but I finally gave up on it, just to kind of save it, for posterity and to be honest, to be transparent. And then I just let it go. I haven't revisited that. Well, Caleb Leathers, unless I find out that he grew up in Haverhill, Massachusetts, is going the same way as A.W. And that has happened a couple times, a few times that I've been wrong. Most of the time I've been right. Even though it seemed implausible, I was able to eventually prove that I was right. This habit of Matthew's of sandwiching his pieces with a poem on top and then the piece and maybe one underneath and one to the side, which all inform each other, all written under different pseudonyms. The pseudonyms, for one thing, confirm each other. So Bertram, if I'm right about this, Bertram is definitely Mathew, which means the other 6 poems by Bertram are also definitely Mathew, and there's some very interesting things in them. But each one tells you about the other one. So the poem and this French story juxtaposed tell you that Abby was persecuted and that Mathew made a sacrifice in marrying her because they both knew that he would fail in business given her reputation, but that, he kind of put a positive cast on it at the end that eventually they would come through. Well, unfortunately, they didn't, really speaking. I would say it crushed them. Society crushed them. It's the same society that I'm up against now, the skeptics, that attack me if I get on a Facebook group. It's the same type of people that attacked Mathew and Abby. Nothing has changed, in that regard. But Mathew and Abby also had friends, and I think I also have friends, and I think I will have more friends in the future. So what I plan on doing is some of what I present will be for the skeptics and will be just flat out 100% incontrovertible proof. So they don't have any wiggle room. Mathew wrote as poems in the Portland Transcript because John Greenleaf Whittier, writing to Mathew privately, said, these are yours. And one of them was signed poems. Done deal. Okay, let's see somebody argue with that. Okay, and the things that are signed poems show that Mathew could write very well in short stories, poetry, reporting, travelogues. It establishes that he could write well in all those genres. And then sometimes I will turn to my more sophisticated detective work that is for people who trust me, basically trust me to be honest and trust me to have some detective skills, pretty good ones. And for those people, I will present some more advanced kinds of things. And I think I'll go forward like that. I don't mean to be so confrontative here, but the vicious skeptics really kind of got to me, I think. So this is just one example. You'll see lots more. If you read my books, you'll see a whole lot more because I pretty much documented all of them. I don't want to give away any of the material regarding Edgar Allan Poe at this point. I'm going to save it until the paper comes out. So far as I know right now, everything's very quiet. Nobody's reading my papers. Nobody's emailing me. I gave up on the Facebook groups and got off them, so nobody's trying to get hold of me through Facebook. It's just a nice, quiet, what Mathew would have called dormouse. Everything is dormouse. So we'll see if it continues that way. I'm going to sign off of this one. We're under 30 minutes. I like to keep them that short if I can. And when something else occurs to me, I'll get back on here.